So this topic is just kind of an overview of the process of pollination, something you might observe while you're out in the field. It's a little bit hard for us to experience pollination together, but if you get a quiet day when you can sit down, usually a nice sunny day, sometimes early in the morning is good, you can just kind of take some time to observe the animals that are visiting plants, and really interesting set of interactions from an ecology standpoint. Um, and I think we're just kind of going to scratch the surface of it here. So as you probably think about flowers, a lot of flowers are built with the purpose of getting pollinated by animals. And so they're attractive, they have rewards, and a lot of times they have a rather specific relationship with pollinators, as we'll see. So first off, a little bit of precision on our definitions here. So when we talk about pollination, pollination is the process of moving pollen from one plant, from the pollen producing organs of a flower, so anthers, to the pollen receiving organs of a flower, so the stigma. So getting the pollen from anther to stigma is pollination. Sometimes that happens within a flower, sometimes between two flowers. And this would be a term that we refer to between sexually compatible flowers, so usually plants of the same species. Now, as far as getting the pollen from one place to another, the thing that moves pollen is a vector. So a vector in this case is just a term for a mover, so something that is going to pick up the pollen and carry it. And that can be biotic or abiotic. So biotic is an animal of some kind, and animals have brains and behaviors and thoughts and needs. And then abiotic pollination vectors would be anything that's not alive, and that almost always refers to wind pollination. So this flower on the left here, actually a collection of many flowers, is broken down into some male flowers at the top and some female flowers lower down on this sedge. Male flowers, big anthers, long anthers with lots of pollen each, and female flowers with big stigmas with lots of pollen receiving surface, and lots of pollen production, lots of pollen receiving, and not a lot of attraction or visual attraction or reward in there, because they're not attracting an animal really in this case. So the second question is, there competition for pollination vectors? Gets into an interesting question. So we've talked not too long ago about invasive species. One of the ways that invasive species can interrupt natural processes in a community is to maybe steal away some of the pollination vectors. So a plant has to compete. If it's getting pollinated by an animal, it's got to compete with what animals might have for their other options. The animals are in it for something that's rewarding to them. They're not necessarily in it simply to do plants a favor. It's a selfish world out there a lot of times. So as I mentioned, abiotic pollination usually refers to wind pollination. These are another couple illustrations of adaptations that are good for wind pollination. So big old anthers, lots of stamens, so lots of pollen production. This is a dioecious plant, the meadow rue, that produces only male flowers on one kind of individual and only female flowers on another kind of individual. And so this male individual is going to produce lots and lots of pollen. And across the different species here, we've got a walnut tree that's showing the pollen receiving part of the equation, with these big, large surface area, big feathery stigmas for receiving pollen, but not much else. So we can see the reproductive organs, but we don't see showy flowers. You wouldn't probably smell much in the way of an aroma. There's not a nectar reward on these flowers. So they're a little bit more streamlined. And they're also a big reason why people have allergies. So sometimes the showy flowers get blamed, like goldenrod has showy flowers, and people often look at the goldenrod and say, that must be the thing that's causing me to have allergies. But it's often these plants we don't really see. If you're not a botanist and you haven't thought about it, you may not think about grasses pollinating each other, or trees with inconspicuous flowers pollinating each other, but nonetheless, that's a big source of pollen in the air for allergies. So here's a couple examples of grass doing its pollination. Biotic pollination is what we typically, I'd say, prefer to talk about most of the time when it comes to pollination vectors. And when we have a pollinator who is an animal, it's necessary to attract the animal. So attraction is required, and then also to reward them. So they need to have a flower that draws their attention. They've got a big array of things that they're looking through the landscape, looking for food sources. And they're going to go to places that they can train their behavior on visiting these flowers and getting some kind of reward. So you may not see the rewards necessarily, but if you pay attention to the animal behavior, you'll see how their behavior sort of has them going to the parts of the flower where they're getting these rewards from. So what kind of rewards are you getting from a flower? Two big ones. One is nectar, which we often think about as the reward for visiting a flower. A couple of these images show flowers with obvious nectar rewarding adaptations. So this is called a nectar spur. On this bladderwort, it's just a pouch kind of at the back of the flower. It's a modified petal, and it heads backwards, and inside of there would be some nectar. And going through this narrow tube here, this means that only certain kinds of insects are going to be able to get that nectar reward. So something with a long tongue typically. A lot of bees have long tongues, also some hummingbirds, probably the wrong size for this one, but some moths and butterflies also have long tongues. And then another one, this is actually a pendant flower hanging downwards, but it's got nectar spurs upright, and this gives the columbine its distinctive appearance. Other ones, maybe not so obvious where the reward is, but these other three flowers that are on here show us some abundant stamens, which could give a hint at a possible pollen reward. So for a lot of pollinators, the pollen itself is the reward. And these are some animals engaged in pollen foraging. So we often think of bees as looking for nectar. Nectar is the main ingredient in honey. And sure enough, that's true. A couple of these images show honeybees, but they're also out there collecting pollen. So this is a pollen basket, they call it, on the back legs of the bee. They take the pollen from the plant and they jam it onto this part of their back legs, and they carry the pollen with them. So often you'll see a visiting bee with this big pollen is usually in the orange-yellow end of the spectrum, so they cram it on there and then carry it. And pollen, in contrast to most nectars, the pollen is richer in proteins and things that are better for the developing larvae. So typically larvae are eating pollen. And as far as just day-to-day energy, the nectar is pretty good for energy to feed the workers, and then also to feed the hive in the form of the honey that gets made. But just you can see some of these, if they're engaged in a whole lot of pollen foraging, they're really like getting that pollen all over. This bee is spending a lot of time on this anther cluster and also getting a lot of pollen on itself. Pollen foraging, also a big one among some of our beetles. So this beetle is visiting lots of these flowers with their reproductive parts sticking out in a way that they can access them. Not sure this would be just a pollinating fly, and I can't tell what it's foraging for right now, but a decent chance it might be mopping up some pollen there. So among our animal pollinators, we have lots of animals. It depends on, of course, the animals that are found in an area. Depends on their behavior, their abundance, their activity at different times of day, different times of year. And so there ends up being a lot of times a pretty tight relationship between the plants that are getting pollinated and the animals that visit them. So over evolutionary time, they're going through selection to kind of optimize this relationship where they're most attractive to the animals that serve them the best, that they're available to those animals the best, that they're sort of a preferred option for them, and so on. Just illustrating kind of the wide variety here. We've got a beetle up in the top here, a bee, a hawk moth. So it's a kind of moth that has a behavior a lot like a hummingbird. Pollinating fly, as we'll see, hummingbird. And then this would not be a local one, kind of an exceptional case worldwide. But in some places of the world, there are pollinating lizards. You can kind of see the adaptation here with this pendant large flowers hanging down and accessible to a lizard who can mop up some nectar and possibly do some pollination there. So we see lots of animals visiting flowers. Flowers are attractive, and they end up being kind of a busy place in the landscape sometimes. And I just want to point out that not every animal that visits a flower is a pollinator. So it's important just not to take that leap of assumption and say just because you see an animal on a flower or visiting a flower that it's going to pollinate. Remember, pollination has a strict definition from the plant's perspective. It needs to get pollen moved from the anthers to the stigma. Usually we think of this between flowers on different plants. So effective pollination would be moving, if you got two species of the same plant, moving from one of those individuals, two individuals of the same species, moving from one of those individuals to the other individual would be successful pollination there. This slide shows a few cases where that might not be the case. Three of these images show us nectar thieves. So this is a behavior called nectar thievery, where it's just kind of obvious that the animals, like this bee in the middle, this bee on the right, they're going after the nectar part of that flower, and they actually pierce a hole in the side of the flower tube, and they're accessing the nectar. But what they're not doing is contacting any of the reproductive parts. So this bee is going after the base of the flower, but not touching anthers, not touching stigma. And that is kind of a waste of energy from the plant, that it's produced this energy-rich nectar, but not getting any pollen transferred for it. So it's a behavior that sometimes pays off for animals. And these are three cases where these are not successfully pollinating. Other cases, you might see animals engaged in behavior that's not really foraging for anything from the plant's perspective. This might not result in any pollination. Here, these two beetles copulating, or this ant visiting a flower. Sometimes ants are visitors to flowers, but ant behavior typically is not quite in line with what the plant needs to get its pollen delivered. So ant behavior is a little more out and back. As far as foraging, this ant might come, lap up some nectar, and then return to its colony. Whereas bees, what we think of as typically the more typical foragers, they have a behavior of visiting flowers over and over and over again through a rather involved set of visits. So it could be that you get a one-time visitor that's not going to transfer pollen to another plant. So there is a system we call pollination syndromes, where you can kind of look across different plants and see similarities in how their flowers are put together. And in a lot of cases, that's the result of convergent evolution on giving animals what they need or want, kind of the kinds of flowers that they might prefer to visit. And like I said before, just sort of honing in on the right form and timing and all these other factors that benefit you the best. So if you have got beetle pollinators, there are certain flowers that are better pollinated by beetles. So these pollination syndromes, they're not absolute. We often see them. You might look at this kind of arrangement and say, yeah, those are probably beetle pollinated. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be exclusive to beetles. So you probably would see this kind of plant and see beetles and also flies and also bees, simply because there's a reward there that can be grabbed by a variety of animals. But for beetles to be successful pollinators, basically they're kind of clumsy. Sorry, beetles. They land on a surface. They're not precision flyers, so they have to land kind of on a broad surface, and they stumble about over the surface. So having lots of small flowers with their reproductive parts out above the surface is kind of a typical beetle pollination syndrome. And then they get some pollen on their body and perhaps fly off to another flower to do similar foraging. So small flowers, lots of them in a kind of a flat top cluster is pretty typical beetle flowering. Butterflies also need a landing place. They're not precision flyers, so when they land, they need to be able to walk around on what they're eating. And they do have the advantage of a long proboscis. So a butterfly has the ability to probe into some of these more restrictive plant parts that have nectar at the bottom. So these nectar spurs and so on. So a variety of flowers here with maybe a little narrow tube with nectar at the bottom. And then along the way, they're contacting the stamens with their feet or maybe part of their proboscis. And then there's also kind of a typical butterfly coloration, a little more in the pastel range of colors. Again, kind of hard to be absolute about these, but here's some examples. Bees, as I mentioned, lots of examples of bee pollinators. There are colony bees, so social bees, and then also solitary bees. And by and large, these are animals that get their nutrients, a lot of their nutrients, by visiting flowers. So different sizes, shapes, foraging patterns. So just a collection of them here on a variety of different flowers. Some of them on the small side, mason bees, sweat bees, and then on the larger side, bumblebees, carpenter bees. And as I indicated in the speciation, the species lecture, the size of the flower should be a good match for an ideal, optimal pollinator on that plant. So sometimes you get small pollinators for small flowers and larger pollinators for larger flowers, but not always. So we mentioned the bees. There also are a good number of pollinating flies. So it seems to me like about half the time when I think I've got a bee at first, it turns out to be one of these and others like them. There are lots that are actually mimics of bees and wasps. And this is because they are flower visitors just like bees are. And this coloration helps them to be less appealing to predators. So what I usually look for on the flies is this really large portion of the head is made up of eyes. So big compound eyes, a little bit different than we saw in the bees. We'll go back to the bees, a little more like a oval eye off to the side. Bees have a constriction, bees and wasps have a constriction on their body in between the thorax and the abdomen. Not always something you can easily see, a little harder to see on the bumblebees. And the flies are just more wide throughout. Technically, the flies have 2 pairs of wings, whereas the bees have 4 pairs of wings. Again, you don't always see that. These are 1, 2, 1, 2 on each side. And flies belong to a group called Diptera, which is the 2-wing group. So syrphids, hoverflies, some cute fuzzy ones called bee flies, even house flies on occasion. Fungus gnats fall into the fly, they're in the fly order, and they visit some of our flowers. Actually, kind of recent papers that I've read show that they're a little more of a pollinator presence than I appreciated before. Some of these have downright bee-like behaviors. Other ones might be a little more opportunist, like the housefly. I don't know if that's always visiting flowers, but sometimes. So as far as advertising to pollinators, one of the pollination advertisements is marks, lines, coloration that directs animals to where the nectar is. So we call them nectar guides. They're often these kind of radial lines that, if you follow them to their center, direct you to where the nectar is. We have radially symmetrical flowers with the guides. We've got bilaterally symmetrical flowers with these guides. So it just, again, kind of ties into the behavioral desires of the bees that are visiting, and that causes them to go where the plant needs them to go. And not only in the visible spectrum, but it turns out that nectar guides are also pretty abundant in spectra of light that we can't see. So among those, the ultraviolet range is pretty common. And so you can do special photographs. On the right here, if you put a filter on your photography equipment, you can take a photograph that shows that some parts of these flowers are absorbing ultraviolet light differently in different parts of the flower. So a couple of examples here, plants that have flowers that look pretty plain to us, look like they're a single solid color. Both of these, we've got Caltha and this Coreopsis, I think. And then over on the right, under UV light, they've got a different coloration. So different towards the outside on both of these. And then the source I got these from had merged their visible range and the UV range of absorbance into a little bit kind of like what it might look like to a bee that can see both of these colors.